Hi there. Welcome back to 19th century art. In this lecture, we're going to examine the French Revolution and its aftermath. Now, this is a huge topic and one that's so important to our understanding of the 19th century. There's more here than I can possibly fit into a brief lecture. So I'm going to focus on a few major artists who were there at the vanguard of this transformation and whose art really speaks to the changing character of the culture surrounding the French Revolution. Jacques-Louis David was an intense man who was passionate about his painting. He came from a lower middle class life. His father died in a duel. He was raised by his uncle. He had a rough scrabble existence. His face, cut by a dagger in a fight, gave him a twisted expression and made it difficult for him to speak. So he was not comfortable around people. He's not the kind of person you would expect to be flattering nobles at a party. He initially trained as a sculptor, but his passion was painting. He tried and failed for 4 years to gain entrance into the Prix de Rome government scholarship to get a trip to Rome for his study of art. This is the initial stepping stone for all artists who hope to gain entrance into the art academy and show work at the Salon. After 4 attempts, he starves himself nearly to death, and finally he gains to this prize, and he's able to go to Rome, where he studies voraciously for several years. Initially, he was not that interested in classical works, saying to a friend, "The antique will not seduce me. It lacks action and does not move me." He became interested in the classical through the writings of Winckelmann, who we mentioned earlier, and made over 1,000 drawings during this period, using reference material for the rest of his life. Once he returned to Paris and dismantled his sketchbooks and reorganized the leaves into albums according to type, we can now go back to them and see the very sources of ancient classical work that he used as the basis of his designs for his paintings. Jacques-Louis David submitted after his return the painting Andromache Mourning Hector, painted in 1780. This is a large dramatic history painting, 9 feet tall, 6 foot 8 inches wide, and it is a much more somber and sober picture than is typically submitted to the Academy at this time. It's more stoic than Baroque, but it uses the face to communicate. The gestures seem to be a little stilted, but the clothing is richly realized, and the faces and the anatomy are very exquisitely rendered. You have to see this sort of dark, foreboding painting in strong contrast to what was typical of the age. Francois Bucher was one of the more celebrated artists of this time, and you can see in his Baroque rendition of Vulcan presenting Venus with the arms for Aeneas from 1757, you can see all the frilly, decorative, ornate, this kind of glowing light that permeates the scene, the fabric that sort of lifts off and enters up into the clouds, cherubim and winged deities and gods, and Vulcan is handing them in this serene gesture, and the gods look on, a little bored, barely tempted by this offering. But this was the way in which people saw the classical past, as something remote, as something pretty, as something allegorical, very distant to the day and age. And this is what David was really trying to challenge, is that we need to see these classical works in the time that we are in now and see them as something more realistic. Now, the word realism didn't really exist at this time. People, when they talked about veracity of something, how close to real it was, they tended to use this word verisimilitude. And that was not to be real, it was to be larger than life. It was to be grand, spectacular. It was supposed to excite our senses with this rich tapestry of colors and shapes and textures. So an actor on stage portraying an ancient Roman emperor would walk on in this manner you see here, with these ostrich feathers and a cane, and he would stand in ballet-like poses in this sort of grand manner. This is what people expected in the theater. But at this time, there were major changes afoot. There was a new actor by the name of Francois Joseph Talma, and he was really interested with David to study the truth of what Romans actually looked like. And so in his play, while all the other actors were decked out in this finery, he walks in a historically accurate toga, and he steals the show. Even though he has only a bit part, this is all people are talking about. The truth, the realism of the depiction of his character, the sincerity of it. This seems to cut directly to the needs of the time, to get down to something that is more truthful about the past and also the present. So the next painting by David is quite a shocker, and this is what we now regard as the quintessential neoclassical style. This is a history painting of the Oath of the Horatii from 1785. It is a bold, dramatic, clearly defined composition with this striking poses, and the composition is clearly telling this dramatic moment right before the battle where the Horatii swear to die to defend their country. And we see the women grieving on the other side, on the right here, looking dejected and forlorn, knowing that this is the end of their family. So this dramatic painting, 10 feet 10 inches by 13 feet 11 inches, is one of these monumental works. But notice these huge cavities. He's not filling this up with decorative filigree. He's not giving us anything but these massive columns in this very solid composition. The floor, the space, everything is clearly defined in this very dramatic way. So it just really stands out from all the frilly nonsense that was happening in all the other paintings. So when we see the differences between the male and postures and actions and dress preparing for war, and we see the contrast with the women, the morality here is really defined by these contrasts, that this way in which women's sphere of life is so distinctly separate from the male sphere of life, that these two contrasting forms are really supporting this narrative in the painting, that men are the actors going to battle decisively, making and taking action for the future, and the women are merely sort of the receptors of that action. The next painting David submitted to the Salon was a brilliant representation of a very famous moment in classical antiquity, the Death of Socrates from 1787. In these paintings, he's not just representing the past, like we're looking at a painting of what happened then. The realism is meant to bring it into our present. It's made to us to really consider what is at stake when people make such historically significant decisions. So Socrates here is reaching for the cup of poison. He's taking it in his hand and he's pointing upward, saying that he must do this. He has been condemned to death, and he will accept that because the alternative is to reject his ideas about truth. And so he cannot live in a world where he lives with anything less than the truth. So he's holding the truth of his ideas above his own life. And so this is a very dramatic moment at this time during these great tensions. It's sort of a call for people to rise up and embrace the truth of the situation, to be honest about what is at stake with the decisions they make and not capitulate their values. So this is a moral drama. It's a powerful moral drama, and it's one that's meant to speak to the moment of the crisis that is brewing inside France. And so this is what makes these paintings so exciting, is they're not just a depiction of the past. They really are trying to get at what's going on in the world in France at this time. Okay, now we can see this incredible flatness here, this beautiful graphic way in which he arranges the space, the sort of plunging hallway and the figures retreating on the back. All of this sets up a wonderful dramatic frame around Socrates in the center of the composition. Now, the great inspiration that David had at this time was John Flaxman, the British artist. Now, Flaxman's drawings were rather thin. I mean, they don't have the same kind of muscular strength that David gives to his figures, but they do have that simplicity and that flatness of design which makes the narrative absolutely crystal clear. And it was this that David took from John Flaxman's designs and what inspired him to move in this new bold direction. Now, the French Revolution is an extraordinary crisis. As I said before, it has huge implications for the rest of the 19th century and indeed much of the 20th century. And in some cases, you might say we are still living with the consequences of this French Revolution. And it comes out of a long simmering problem that had been going on in France. There was hunger, failed harvest, a growing population. The government was taxing only the poor with their most basic needs, a salt tax. And there was incredible inequality. The commoners had very few legal rights and no representation in government, and were brutally punished for any crimes that they might have been accused of. And so this way built upon some very critical problems that could have been addressed with a constitutional convention. And there were many people calling for such action. But this need to rewrite the tax code because the government was broke, and a whole series of missteps, mistrust, and misinformation escalates this crisis into a full-scale revolution. It was never a sure thing that the revolution would take place. It was Louis XVI's indecision and gross incompetence that exacerbated these problems and made it absolutely impossible for anything to happen but this absolute destructive force of the people overthrowing their government in revolution. Now, much of what happened, again, were the royals' unwillingness to negotiate and the royals' unwillingness to accept the seriousness of the problem. There were half steps which allowed people to begin to speak to their government about their needs, but then the people who were loyal to these changes would get sacked. Now, there's what we call the three estates in French government. So to understand what's at stake here, the three estates were the first, the clergy, the second, the nobility, and then everyone else, which really was 93% of the population who had no rights or representation in government. The third estate found some representatives and took a collective oath not to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances require until a constitution of the kingdom is established, so that they have some access to representation. Oath at the tennis court, again, was stymied by political inaction. Finally, there was this very symbolic act of the storming of the Bastille, a fortress outside Paris, and it was home to political prisoners, and there was a desire to tear down this symbol of oppression. So the massive crowd breaks through the barricades and they begin dismantling and tearing it apart. There really wasn't anybody inside. This had been decommissioned some years before, and now they were only housing 7 prisoners. This action seemed to quell the demand for action, but still the people were hungry and nothing had been done. Finally, on the 5th of October, the women of Paris took action on their own and they marched to Versailles en masse, and they demanded to see the king and queen, who barely escaped with their lives. This was a way in which they began to bring the king under force to hear their demands directly. Unfortunately, the king, in a confused attempt at escaping, is captured, and then his fate is sealed. They know they no longer can trust him to act on their demands. And so there is a trial held, and Louis XVI is executed on January 21st, 1793. The Republic of France was declared. The revolution became more radical and more violent, and during this time, many nobles were put on hasty trials, and some 1,400 people were considered potential enemies of the Republic were executed in Paris. And of course, to do this massive amounts of killing in the most efficient way, they came upon this device we now call the guillotine. Now, the guillotine was an invention of a man who would have been horrified by its use. Joseph Ignace Guillotin created this idea of this axe that fell from this tower as a way to make an easier route for execution, because prior to this, people were basically using axes, or if you were a noble, maybe a sword. But this often, the axe would be blunt, or the executioner would miss, and it would make for an incredibly messy and difficult time. The guillotine solves this problem. So much easier and cleaner to just flick a switch, and without the danger of torture. But with this ease of execution, the number of executions absolutely exploded. The guillotine was used in France for many, many years. The last state use of a guillotine was 1977. And finally, the death penalty was completely abolished in France in 1981. So this period of time, this bloodshed after the execution of the king and the queen, Marie Antoinette, was what we call the Reign of Terror. And the man in charge was initially given this post because he was considered the most rational, most sensible, most cool-headed of the revolutionaries. He was a man of the Enlightenment. Maximilien Robespierre became the member of the Committee of Public Safety, and so he took it on himself to root out anyone who was not sincerely engaged with the revolution. So during this time, this 5-year period, 17,000 executions took place. Finally, Robespierre himself was guillotined, and everyone stepped back and said, okay, we need to stop. This reign of terror has gone too far. So during this time of the Reign of Terror, it was not advisable to look like a noble, whereas the fashion of the day prior to the French Revolution was to follow in a style somewhat similar to what the nobles wore. You wore breeches, you wore a long waistcoat, these and a tri-cornered hat. All of this gave way to a new style of dress. Long trousers, a shorter jacket, and a floppy hat, which became known as the Phrygian cap. This floppy cap was a symbolic gesture back to classical times. It was used in ancient Rome. When a slave was granted their freedom, they were allowed to wear this cap. And so it was a symbol of the revolution. It becomes a symbol of emancipation. During the Reign of Terror, Jacques-Louis David paints this absolutely stunning painting, The Death of Marat. Again, we have a powerful depiction of an actual historic moment. Marat had been a passionate revolutionary, and he had a debilitating skin disease that kept him in a bath. He continued to write these incendiary pamphlets demanding the royals be accountable for their crimes. Charlotte Corday, who was part of the nobility, gained access to meet with Marat on the pretense that she was going to, name names and turn in other royals who are in hiding. And instead, she pulls out a dagger and stabs him to death. And so we have this very dramatic moment here. This man who was a passionate revolutionary has died. And you see him here holding the letter that Charlotte Corday has given him, blood-stained now, and his hand lying limp. And in this moment, we see this very oppressive ground framing the gesture of his hand coming down. He's still in his dying breath holding on to the pen that he was so powerfully in charge of. And so we see Marat as this dying figure, prone as if he were the Christ descended from the cross, as a kind of classical martyr pose. Now, in 1799, Jacques-Louis David, this is right at the end of the Reign of Terror, he paints this extremely dramatic depiction of a classical battle. Now we know the men of Rome went to battle without any armor on as a show of their masculine strength. And we see them here wearing only their shield and their spears, and they're clashing, and the Sabine women demanding the battle end. And so we see this very dramatic pose, this woman rushing into battle, exposing herself to the violence, the children on the ground, and they are trying to stop all further violence. So this was a very dramatic painting at a moment when France was engulfed in violence. Jacques-Louis David is demanding there be peace finally. Now, this painting is really striking for many reasons. Most people, when they take up the subject of the Sabine women in classical antiquity, use it as a sort of an excuse to talk about voluptuous women being carried off by burly soldiers, such as we see the Pietro da Cortona's painting, The Rape of the Sabine Women. And there are lots of examples of this. Baroque swirling cloths, and we can see the women are completely powerless in this case. So in a sense, you have to look at Jacques-Louis David's painting as a contrast to what is typically shown. And so it would have been very startling to see this version of the story of the Sabine women. And to make sure you really understand what he's getting at, he's placed in the background a very important, iconic piece of architecture. He's included this fortification which is very similar to the Bastille in Paris. So he wants people to know that, hey, folks, remember that symbol of oppression that we were all fighting about? This is what the context for this painting brings home, this idea that what we're really talking about here is the French Revolution. The Reign of Terror ends, and there are a lot of changes the revolutionary government wanted to make. And they started to reinvent the calendar and the times of day, and everything was considered in a different kind of way of breaking out of the structures of the past. Initially, the Art Academy was disbanded, but eventually people realized they wanted some kind of structure. So Jacques-Louis David begins to reimagine a way that the Academy can work and to bring about the salons every 2 years so that they can start to celebrate the great achievements of art of this time. One very interesting development was the Paris apartment of the king, the Louvre, which had been used to house art and art collections and studios for artists, was opened up to the public. And in this painting by Hubert Robert, we see this first glimpse of what the Louvre, this very famous national museum, that with the Louvre began. It was all these paintings that had been in the royal collection, and people could go there and look at and study the art. You can see artists there with their sketchbooks. There are women there with their sketchbooks and they're painting and copies of these works of art. And this is how people learned how to make art. They copied classical works. I want to end this lecture with this very important painting because during the Revolution, not only was the Louvre opened up for women to look at art, there are also special parts of the Louvre where women could study art. And here we see an example of that. This is a painting by Marie Denis Villiers, who has painted a portrait of Marie Josephine Charlotte Duval d'Oran. Now, these women are serious in their study of art. We can see the room is dim, it's nothing special. We see them intently focused on what they're doing. And Marie Josephine Charlotte Duval d'Oran is looking back at us with this concentrated gaze. She is looking at us, and it's not clear whether we are the subject now that she is drawing, or are we just distracting her from her work? We look past her, and we can see on the parapet on the far side of the Louvre a man and woman courting each other. This distant image of what she has given up when she chose to be an artist.